What is up, my friends? This is Trip, and this is the AAR, American Academy of Religion, very special live podcast we did with Elizabeth Johnson. Elizabeth Johnson, like one of the most influential living theologians of all time. That's right. This podcast was from San Antonio. We were at Blue Star Brewing Company there, and it was during the AAR, which is like the guild meeting of all the religion professors all over the world. So there's like 10,000 or so religion professors in a city reading papers to each other with books about books and footnotes and stuff. Hard to follow. This is like kind of like the nerdy release fun part. And in it, Scott MacDougall, been on the podcast before. Haven't listened to the episode on More Than Communion. You should go back and listen to it. Great book, great episode. He and I put together two different events at AAR. One is this, a live podcast. Elizabeth Johnson joins us. We interview her about her work, her life, her thought. It was awesome. Then, Cindy Rigby, Monica Coleman join us, and we talk about the different trajectories and what it means, different forms of feminist theology look like, what it means to be a minister, a theologian of the church as a feminist and such. And that was amazing. And then there's a LectioCast in the live event. And you may be saying to yourself, Trip, I didn't hear the LectioCast on here. That's right, because this is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. Daniel Kirk, who runs the LectioCast, and for those of you that don't know, that is a weekly lectionary podcast at Homebrewed we put together, where every Monday you can get ideological engagement with the biblical text for the week if you're at a church that follows the lectionary. Even if you don't. Who doesn't like some nerdy biblical exegesis time? That's what it's for. Well, the third part of that live podcast, Daniel Kirk joins, and then he talks with Monica, Cindy, and Scott about Bible-type things, worship, life at church. And if you want to hear that, you're going to need to go over the LectioCast. And I think you should, because it's awesome. I mean, I even enjoyed it, and I wasn't even on stage then. That's how good it was. So, yeah, this was a complete blast. So thankful and grateful for Elizabeth Johnson, for Monica, for Cindy, and for Scott helping to organize it. And if you're totally digging this, know that if you go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com, on the post for this, you'll find a link over to a series, another special episode that we did at AR, where people read papers engaging her work and she responded. So if you're a legit nerd and want to have your mind blown away by Elizabeth Johnson, then go to the website and go get the extra special episode, where you'll hear a number of different theologians engage your work, including friend of the podcast, Austin Roberts. That's right. He and I have been really good friends. Glad that he got to be a part. And I know who most of you are just going to be really excited about this. JC responded. That's right. Just Catherine Keller and Elizabeth Johnson engaging there. It was pretty awesome. So this live podcast from Blue Star Brewing Company, and I really think you should dig it. It's fun. It was a blast. And before we jump in, I just want to tell everyone two quick things. One, if you were sitting there and saying January's coming and it could be cold where I live, what I'd really like to do is get nerdy and have some craft beer, then you should come to Theology Beer Camp. And even if that's not true, you should still come to Theology Beer Camp. It is the first Homebrewed Christianity produced event, and it's going to be here in Los Angeles on the beach this January 19th to 21st. You can go to theologybeercamp.com, get more information. It's going to be zesty. It's going to be awesome. And like the ticket includes like over $100 of food, beer tastings, swag, stuff you take home, some books and pint glasses and things. So now when you go, like you're getting a full-on robust experience. So check it out. Also, this summer, Homebrewed Christianity is working with our friends at the Common Pilgrim to do a spiritual pilgrimage to Germany in August. It is a 10-day trip following the footsteps of Martin Luther on this 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And if you're interested in going on a spiritual pilgrimage, which includes like history, theology, nerdiness with Luther in Germany, followed by evenings at a beer garden, and some friends of the podcast that are German, I don't want to name names, but you could go through the podcast and look at all the different German theologians that have been on and say, I bet they might be the theologians that join when we have beer camp time in certain cities where they live. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's right. Anyway, we're going to have beer time in the beer garden at night. We'll be reading some Luther, discussing it, reflecting on our own lifetime of transition as a church. And if you're interested in that, then you can go to the website, or you can just text Luther if you live in the US of A. Text the word Luther to 44222, and you'll be sent some information. That's right. Text the word Luther to 44222. 44222. 2 4s, 3 2s. Anyway, or you can go to the website. There'll be links. And then you can find out more about it. And I'm super pumped. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be blessed. So yeah, enjoy that. Now, know that this episode, the podcast, the live event and everything was sponsored by our friends at The Common Pilgrim. It was also sponsored by our friends at Fortress Press, Theology for the People, the ones that put out the Homebrewed Christianity Guide series. That's right. You can go to homebrewedguides.com, see all 10 of the books, the 3 that are out, the 7 that are coming. You can get all 10 of them at a cheap price and then get lots of free perks too. But just now, the third one, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God came out. Monica Coleman's book. It's also a Theology for the People text. And so we talk about that in the podcast. And then our friends at Presence. Presence is like an integral Christian, like a nonprofit. They organize, lead, network using kind of integral theory, Christianity, and work in to really develop leadership vision and stuff. To work in a religiously pluralistic environment where we don't let the forms of our religious tradition keep us from embodying the spirit, prophetic and beautiful, living in them in our pluralistic troubled times. So if you are interested in more of that, then here's a cool thing. If you go to the website, you can click through, and they made like a free for podcast listeners video series that introduces integral thought spiral dynamics and the way they use it and think about dealing with these issues. Pretty awesome. My buddy Doug King is in videos, and if you know Mike Morrell, who recently published a book with Richard Rohr that's is pretty popular, people talking about that Divine Dance book, he works there as well. Pretty awesome people. Very glad they sponsored the podcast. So without further ado, the one, the only Elizabeth A. Johnson. Boom, shakalaka, laka, laka. Tonight, I'm excited because episode 38, and I'm on like 980 some, was the first time Elizabeth Johnson was on the podcast. And if you go listen to the first time I ever interviewed her, I was still in North Carolina, so I talked like this while I was asking her questions. And I said, on page 56 of She Who Is, you say that the language of God functions? And she goes, well, the language does function. And I was like, mm-hmm. So my accent got better through the years because you just can't do a PhD at Claremont with a Southern accent and get taken seriously at all. So you just have to like fake it and until it goes away some. Anyway, I really appreciate all of you being here and the sponsors, everyone. So right now, I'd like for you to give a hand as my friend and partner for the evening, Scott, heads on up here. So, Scott, here's the question. You are a real theologian with a career in teaching. Why would you have said yes to cooperating?
I don't know. Against my better judgment.
Oh, no, that's not why.
Why? Well, then why? Why?
I don't know why. I don't think you're working against your judgment. I thought it was just your sheer love and affection for Elizabeth Johnson.
That is true. It is my sheer love and affection for Elizabeth Johnson. So I think there are very few people that when a teacher walks into a classroom, they think, who do I want to emulate while I do this work? She's one of those people. So it's a real gift to have been a student of Elizabeth Johnson. So I can't think of a better thing to do with my time than to honor Elizabeth Johnson.
So if you would all join me in welcoming Elizabeth Johnson.
I have to say, Beth, how does a good Catholic girl growing up in Brooklyn find herself as one of the most foremost theologians working in the country today? What's that journey like? A good Catholic girl,
Simple question.
II.
Yeah, no, the truth of it is that wasn't my goal. I just wanted to study theology. I loved it. And then I wanted to teach it. And then certain position, you have to write about it, publish or perish. And slowly one thing led to another. You develop the habit. You go to conferences, you meet people, you get ideas, you question. And so it was just very organic. It just grew. And how, it turned out and is turning out is not something that I planned.
Who were some of those influences along the way that helped you figure out that was the direction you were going to go in?
Part of it is that I am a woman religious, a nun, so to speak, in the Catholic Church. And the sisters in my community, we ran a college. We do, St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn and in Patchogue, Long Island. And as the college expanded, we needed more theology professors. And so that was suggested I would be eligible, go get a doctorate, come teach. So that was a big influence. I mean, that was the original trigger in terms of higher ed for myself. But I also was very influenced by a number of teachers that I had at graduate school. And what we were saying before, a number of theologians whom I didn't have in graduate school. But when I was in graduate school, I was the only woman in all my classes. I didn't have a female professor. I never read of anything, a book or an essay by a woman in any course, not even on my doctoral comprehensive list. So while we were in a very patriarchal theology setting, at that point, feminism was beginning. And people, books like Mary Daly, Rosemary Ruther, Elizabeth Josephine Renzer, they were beginning to come out. And so there was a network of women in Washington, D.C., and we formed a women's reading group. And so outside of my formal education, that started to take root. And those questions just absolutely intrigued me. And I felt they had a moral urgency. So that would be more influence as well.
Fantastic.
What was the moment when you realized that these institutions, the academy and the church, were at least pausing long enough to be disturbed by the questions that you were raising? Because I was talking to a 26-year-old first-year div student teaching, and I was like, I'm going to get to talk to Elizabeth Johnson. And she goes, well, tell her thank you, and then ask, what was it like? Because now I don't have a syllabus that looks like that, and my reading list is completely different. And I want to know what it was like to see movement start to happen.
Movements started to happen when I became a professor then in my own syllabus. It was still difficult to find essays with much diversity. And that was the other thing. This was all white in the beginning to speak of in terms of scholarship in theology. There was one meeting of the Catholic Theological Society of America in Atlanta when we met by invitation with Jacqueline Grant. And she talked to us about the experience of Black women. That blew me away. That changed my mind. I began to use her book, White Woman's Christ, Black Woman's Jesus, was the name, and made an impression on me. And then that once again opened up more questions. I'm saying, so if that's one group of women that's not being heard, then what other groups of women aren't being heard? And what other experiences aren't coming to the table in terms of interpreting the meaning of faith from different perspectives?
You use the word experience there, and I think for a lot of us that are kind of recently trained theologians, we think it's like kind of essential to take experience seriously. And we may think one of the unique features of your work is taking experience seriously and the tradition. Can you describe what it was like to start to take different people's experience seriously, but not abandon the tradition you're critiquing?
Yeah, and I think that's in a way so important to me, because what I was trained in those all-male classrooms was, in fact, the tradition. It was a very a doctrinal church with a very high approach of thinking about doctrine and applying it and so on and so forth. So when experience came in, it seemed disruptive at first. And it was the analysis really that Rosemary Ruther was doing, that doctrinal tradition itself was reflective of experience, only a certain other kind of experience of a certain other group. So of elite men, ordained men in the Catholic Church over the centuries formed that expression of the faith. And once I began to realize, I'd say there is no non-contextual theology. It's all coming out of somebody's experience of God or the way they pray or relate or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then I began to feel in myself a greater freedom to say, all right, then this is a legitimate move to make, to bring women's experience in. But at the same time, I did not want to lose what I had been educated in, namely the value of a living tradition. Because for hundreds of 2,000 years and prior to that Jewish tradition, people have prayed, have struggled, have looked for meaning in life, gotten through suffering and joy. With a community around them that has believed the way the world is a certain way because of Christ. And I didn't want to lose that. Mm-hmm. Not that anybody was telling me to lose it, but my effort was to really think through, now that women's voices are rising, then does that put the whole tradition in jeopardy? And of course, Mary Daly, good Irish Catholic girl that Mary Daly was, had her revelation of how patriarchal it all was, and her solution was to become a post-Christian feminist, was to leave the church. And that's certainly an option. And there's certain lot of younger people in my classes, young women doing that today, But my question was, it's so patriarchal, and I agree with her analysis, but is there a moment of grace in the tradition too that can be brought forward and it can grow and change the community? And that was the perspective I was going with. It was my hope that I was having, that could work,
And connected to that, and connected to your ongoing commitment to the tradition, you've also had an ongoing commitment to the church. And part of your vocation as a theologian has always been to have one eye on the academy and one eye on the ecclesia. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the vocation of the theologian as in service not only to the academy, but to the church.
See, that's another great question, because I see theology as part of a reform movement within Christianity. It isn't just those that are actively doing something else, but the thinking. If you can change the way the narrative is told, the way God is named, who functions. And I say that with my New York accent. I thought that's what you were going to say before. And if you can change the pattern, the values that come forward then in the story, you then have you have an impact on the church. And I think some of the pushback that I've received has come from the church and from church authorities precisely for that reason. Yeah.
Which is really interesting. People have been hurt by churches, right?
Absolutely.
We've been hurt by the church.
Been killed. Well, talk about women being
exactly.
No, lighting the fires, the witch burnings and so on. Yeah.
And when you mention folks like Mary Daly who talk about how there is a live option of turning away from the church, despite the pain that you have experienced from the institutional church, you've never been tempted, as far as I'm aware, to turn away from that church. And I wonder, in the face of that challenge and that pushback, what keeps you aligned with the Catholic Church that you love? What keeps you going?
Everyone.
Okay.
In other words, it's the community. The tremendous community support from fellow theologians, from my students, from people all over the country, all over the world, thousands and thousands of letters. It's just, Catherine is nodding. She was my graduate assistant and she helped me reply to some. Just knowing that the work was helpful to people and that the criticism was coming in a way that I felt was untoward and even not honest. So it was the community that kept me going and continues to. But I have to also say I am a stubborn Irish woman. And my Irish gets up and you're not putting me out of here. This is my church and I'm going to stay. And so now I didn't start out being this way. You see, it was going this route. It brings you out into certain moments and then they become crossroads.
Well, you sort of see that as a theological commitment in itself, right?
I do.
That's part of the entailment of being a theologian.
Yes.
That you stand your ground in that respect, right?
Right. So help me God, I can do no other.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So you have a new book out. So tell us the title and
the title and the subtitle.
Yeah.
Okay, because that one explains the other. Okay,
Definitely.
so the title is "The Strength of Her Witness." Subtitle: Jesus Christ in the Global Voices of Women.
And this isn't your first Christology. I found out today. And I'm now going to have to go fix a section where I footnote your first one and haven't read the second one in my dissertation. So, anyway.
I think it's very, very interesting that your first published book, actually, before even She Who Is, was Consider Jesus.
Right.
Which was a publication of a series of lectures based on some teaching that you did in apartheid South Africa. And now, your latest book is another Christology that is coming at another crucial moment. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some consonances and dissonances between those two sets of contexts and the ways that your thinking about Christ has changed over time, and if there's any current learning that we can profit from in the most recent volume that you've edited on Christology.
Right. The Consider Jesus book came from the lectures, as Scott said, that I gave in South Africa in 1987, when South Africa was still under apartheid. And I have never seen a church so under the gun for standing for the gospel as was happening in the church in South Africa at that point. It put me in mind of what we've learned about the early church, a church of confessors and martyrs. So many of the lay catechists and the priests that I taught there that summer had been detained and interrogated under torture simply for the work in the townships that they were doing. One priest said to me, I preached in the township on a Sunday that God loves you to the people and then get arrested because you're promoting the dignity of people who are non-persons in that society. It was my walking into that kind of racism blew my mind, but also the witness of people who believed in Jesus Christ and was standing up for the dignity of those people because of their faith. It was a moment of conversion for me as well. So yeah, I came back, and that too played into my own sense of doing feminist theology for the same reason, because women were the lowest of the low, even under apartheid. So this new book came about as a result of a course I teach at Fordham called Christ in World Cultures. Mm-hmm. And we take a tour around all the continents. And most of the books and essays that I was finding and using in my class were all written by men. And they were good, but I was always supplementing by the library. But no, I mean, I like good theology done by men as well as women. But it wasn't women's, there was missing. It was only half the picture, So I had done over the years a lot of research into women's work in Asia, in Africa, in Australia, Latin America on Christ, and was bringing it into the classes through reserved works in the library. And I finally got the idea, why don't I cull all of this and put it together in one book that shows what women in fact are doing in Christology. Every woman in the book, there are 25, all have earned doctorates. They are all professors, either in seminaries or universities or colleges. They're professionals. These pieces were all written already and published. I didn't commission anything. So in itself, it says over the last 50 years, what has happened in terms of women doing scholarship in theology, not just in this country, but around the world. But then the interesting thing, if you're a woman living in India, married to you're a Catholic, but you're married to a Hindu, and your home altar has a crucifix and Krishna side by side, how are you interpreting Jesus Christ? I find that essay fascinating. Astrid Lobo Gajiwala, and so on and so forth. So this book has sort of scoured the world to cull together the voices of women. And the strength of her witness, which is the title, is, of course, that line from John's Gospel with the Samaritan woman when she leaves her water jar, just like the men had left their boats, and goes and tells her town about Jesus, and many believed in him on the strength of her word or her witness. So the idea of women being able to articulate a full-fledged Christology is also not well recognized, but I hope to make a contribution. But your point is, what do I see is happening there? Yeah. Women around the world, and this is in the essays, they're dealing with racism, dealing with poverty, dealing with prejudice against women in all kinds of cultural ways, both in society and the church. And what's coming through now is in a different way, but almost you could say it's similarly to what I was learning in South Africa, is the power of the gospel to transform lives if it is really lived. You know, and in order to really be lived, it needs to be articulated, needs to be preached, and it needs to be thought about. And that's the theology piece.
And that's when I was teaching undergraduates, one of the things that I would teach was chapter 2 of Consider Jesus, where you talk about the importance of telling the story, theorizing the story, and living the story. And that if you don't do that, or if you do that, how risky that is. And when you think about teaching that in apartheid South Africa, and what a risk that exposes you to. Mm-hmm. And you think about this in the context that the new book is dealing with as well, those risks have not diminished. No, those risks are as present now as ever they were.
It's true. Yeah. And, you know, I always, when I'm teaching this, say to some of my students, you know, what's using Skillebex, you know, if you're following Jesus, where are you going to end up on? You know, it's like you end up on the cross. So it's not a simple way, but the joy of it, you know, and the cross is not the end either of the story. So it makes it a worthwhile way of living a life, I think. That's what fundamentally I find. And again, not without everyone else who's involved in the same endeavor. Yeah.
Can you describe the questions that come up when experiences, voices, and really parts of the church that tend to be ignored by the academy are taken seriously? Because I think if you think through the history of Christology, we can pick the 5 questions with the most ink and the most arguments. And what's amazing is how few people that are part of the church lose sleep over them. And when we start to take other people's experience as members of the living body of Christ seriously, maybe we don't dismiss the tradition, but we realize part of the living tradition that we're in means taking different questions seriously as we take their experiences seriously.
One of the women writing from the Philippines in this new book said that what we need today is a new Nicaea and a new Chalcedon to do for our age what they so well did for theirs, but that's not our questions anymore. You know? I mean, we're on their shoulders, so to speak, but you know, what's seriously in question now is just very different, you know. So I think what happens, you know, I was pushed at the end of Quest for the Living God, which came out in 2007 and created quite a pushback from church authorities, in which I traveled around. It's like Consider Jesus around the world, and different theologies of God coming up out of different experiences, right? Someone said to me, because I have the woman's experience, African American experience, Latino experience, even experience of the animals and the plants, doing from an ecological point of view. If I were to add more chapters, what haven't I put in? And I said, now that I'm almost 10 years out from that book, certainly a chapter on LGBTQ experience of God. How does that play out? And also, I'd love to write a chapter on the experience of God of married people, seriously married people, sexually happy married people. In the Catholic Church, almost everyone who's a saint is either celibate or martyred. I mean, you're just like, you're just, and it's worse for women, because, you know, the only women who aren't of that nature are those who are queens of nations. I once was giving a talk in New York City. I said, it's only the queens, and that, of course, got a different kind of a laugh. Anyway, now I gauge the way I say that.
It's good to learn from one's guests, right?
Yes, right. But I think married people in their sexual fidelity, in their raising of children, in the day in and day out of what it takes to maintain intimacy with another, there's an experience of God there that the church has hardly tapped, and that could be very rich for all the rest. So it seems to me, my experience, Trip, has been the more we bring in voices that haven't been listened to, the richer the whole faith becomes. That's really, I think, the way it works.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is how, I mean, even the way you frame it, that these are other experiences of God. We want to hear them, investigate them, reflect on them. There's this tendency of this desire and joy of gathering these new experiences and letting it inform our theological reflection. But the phrase experiences of God has a confidence about the presence and activity of God in those experiences that if you have a PhD in theology, 3/4 of what you did was coming up with reasons to put some distance between experience, the word of, and God. Can you describe, like, methodologically, or as a theologian, what it's like to take those experiences seriously as experiences of God and not just tradition poetics from different peoples or something like that would essentially be anthropological? Right.
I think, from my own work, I do think that God is an unnameable mystery, an infinite, incomprehensible. And nowadays, when I speak and write this, I said mystery of love, because I don't think we can just leave it that way. If you're doing the revelation through Jesus Christ, and that's what that is, So, my sense is very often that comes through in darkness, that comes through in absence. There's a line in Edna St. Vincent Millay about someone who died whom she loved. The presence of her absence is everywhere. The grief. So I think the dark night of the soul, mystics have talked about that. The search for God, the fragmentation, and the way our world is now, crazy making in some ways, it's even more difficult. Who has time to sit and contemplate the eternal verities when you're on your phone all day?
Somebody tweet that right now.
Well, it's true.
It's absolutely true. That's why it should be tweeted.
The lack of silence, the lack of attention, the lack of just space in your spirit, But anyway, so it isn't just, we're always in this ecstasy of the presence of God, or the experience of God is not immediately to hand. It's always mediated through one another, through all kinds of symbols and moments of the day and so on and so forth. But I think in the end, I myself would still want to name what we're talking about G-O-D. Whatever that stands for. Carl Rahner has a essay in the beginning of Foundations. Well, what do we mean by that word? And he spends page after page saying what we don't mean by it, but what most people take that we mean. So it's sort of a shorthand for this sense of infinite nearness, of the transcendence that, however, is within and all encompassing. In all and overall, through all, I think. I would still want to call that God, mainly, I think, because of what Scott was saying. I don't only have my eye on the academy, but also on the church. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, you can't leave it only on the anthropological level. Mm-hmm. You can, but I would choose not to. Yeah.
Plus, Beth, there's something in that language, right? There's something in your work that is very precise about the way we should use language and the way we should not use language. Mm-hmm. And so you want to preserve the word G-O-D, not only because of what you take it to stand for traditionally, but because there's something about the way we speak about the divine mystery of love that's important. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
In terms of the symbol of God functions again,
Yeah. Or functions, whichever way you want to put it.
Right. I remember, before I wrote She Who Is, I was in Washington, D.C. teaching, and the premier of Russia came for a visit, Gorbachev. And Reagan was president, okay? And some reporter had ferreted around and found out that that Gorbachev's grandparents had him baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church. And yet he was the head of the Soviet Union, atheist state. And so this reporter, he was out on the sidewalk and coming out from his hotel, and there's whole phalanx of reporters, and one of them stuck the microphone out and asked him. He said, we know you were baptized. Do you believe in God? And this was on TV. They captured it on the evening news. And Gorbachev answered back, God, I don't believe in him. And I said, you see, even the people who don't believe in God think in a patriarchal way that it's this gigantic Superman in the sky or something, that set me off for days, and
I can only imagine.
In thinking about how powerful cultural, so it isn't just the academy and the church, it's the society affected by those that in fact also have these ideas of God and the way it functions, So to me, it just all across the board important that we speak well and of God in ways that are careful and connected with the tradition, but fresh and engaging, and then that becomes acted out in our ethical stances, in our practice, right?
And do those remain, in your view, connected to the traditional ways of speaking, or is there a way in which they're a re-articulation or a reconstruction?
I think they can be both. I really do. I think, when I wrote She Who Is, I scoured scripture for the feminine images of God, wisdom and ruah and so on. And I was thrilled to find that there was so much there that we had overlooked. So I keep arguing to this day, we need to change the lectionary, get some of these readings in so people hear them if they're churchgoers and people can preach on them and so on. But in addition, there are all kinds of new ways, and why should that not be true if the Holy Spirit is still walking with the church through history and leading the church, So I do remember The Color Purple. Remember that Alice Walker's novel, I do believe it pisses God off if we pass a field of purple and don't notice it, And in the end, the color purple became a symbol for the beauty of God that was then being reflected back on Celie, this damaged young woman. And I thought, the color purple as an image of God, how wonderful is that, So generating out from our arts and even now, of course, today our sciences, images of God, and then all kinds of different human experiences and nature. Yeah. So I don't see that there's a conflict because if God is in fact an infinite mystery of love, you can never have language adequate enough. So the more you put in, the richer you begin to realize what we're dealing with is. Yeah.
And so I would like to ask you, since we only have a limited time left, one thing I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about, since it's not an obvious connection, right? How do you connect in your work Christology and the doctrine of evolution?
Well, very simply, actually. First of all, I just take evolution for granted.
Okay.
Myself, all right? I'm in a tradition where that is not an issue. We don't interpret Genesis literally, so there's room for what science discovers, all right?
Yep.
But you just said Christ. You made this very specific.
Sure did.
And if you take the incarnation seriously and you take it according to John's gospel and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, my entry into this connection between Christ and evolution is sarx, is the flesh. That Jesus didn't become a human being. That's not what John's gospel says, anthropos. Or a man, aner in Greek, a male, but sarx, the flesh. And once you go into scripture, two ways you go with this. I've gone. Sarx, the flesh in the scripture, stands for all living creatures, the matter of all living. So I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, or the covenant with the creatures after Noah in Genesis. I make a covenant with all flesh on the earth, and so on. So Jesus becomes incarnate as a human being, but we ourselves, the other way to go, are the result of an evolutionary process. Our flesh is connected with the flesh of all other creatures also on this planet. So the incarnation is saying, and the way I like to put it, God didn't just create a world and look upon it with love from afar, but joined it in person and in the flesh. including its death, which comes to all living creatures, in order to save from within. So I think there's a profound connection in the doctrine between Christ and evolution that, again, we haven't paid attention to.
Well, some of us have, and I want you to know that when I'm in front of a classroom, what you just articulated comes through my mouth. So thank you for that very much. Sister Elizabeth A. Johnson, we raise our glass to you for teaching us that the symbol of God functions, for teaching us that creation is the incarnation of our God, for teaching us that love does not stop at the doors of a church, for teaching us that theology can change the world, and for teaching us that a girl from Brooklyn can become one of the most important voices of a generation. To Elizabeth Johnson.
Here.
Thank you. Really, thank you. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Well, if Monica A. Coleman and Cindy can come up this way, we are about to have ourselves some fun. So, I want to know what y'all are thinking. And in getting done listening to Elizabeth share and stuff, like what of her story, reflections, and things resonates as scholars for you?
I just so appreciate, as I know we all do, Elizabeth Johnson. I was thinking as she spoke about how much from a distance she served as a mentor to me. She doesn't remember probably, but when I wrote my first book review, so I've been a professor 21 years. When I wrote my first book review, it was on She Who Is, for Theology Today. And one day I went to my mailbox and here's this letter from Elizabeth Johnson, a thank you letter for the review that I, of course, saved forever. And another time, right after the fiasco of Reimagining 93. Anyone remember that? 1993? Yeah, a few people. She kind of talked me down one time because I was kind of falling apart about the state of the church, not being willing to support, feminist conferences. And she reassured me that Sophia was in charge and that, things would work out. But, I just, really appreciate that role. And, I guess what I'm thinking right off the bat is how can we continue to be mentors to each other in the work that we're doing as theologians of the church and the academy both.
Well, I first encountered She Who Is in my theology course with Sally McFaig, and she gave us a choice of reading Marjorie Suhaki's God Christ Church or Elizabeth Johnson's She Who Is. Like any good MDiv student, I chose the shorter book first, which was Marjorie's book, and I was like, what is this process crap? And I read Elizabeth Johnson's She Who Is. The irony, right? As a process theologian, and Marjorie ended up being my dissertation advisor. But I understood She Who Is. And, I just came off a panel with Carol Christ and Judith Plaskow, and I think of how, I don't see you in the audience, but how you, Elizabeth Johnson, and so many others were like the onlys and the firsts, and you had these syllabi with no people of color on them and no women on them, and no one knew what you were doing or understood it or thought it was valid. And you created a world and a syllabus and a theological realm that I could then take for granted.
Right.
And didn't have to fight the fights that you had, knowing how real they are. Particularly for those who chose to stay within the traditions they were in and transform. So I feel such gratitude, really.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So both of you are professors who teach future ministers, right? There's a lot of different religion scholars, but you both teach the Christian tradition to future Christian ministers and take it seriously, right? And realize that you're as stewards of a tradition where more space is made now than before. What is it like to own that vocational space, recognizing both what you've inherited in a sense from early feminist scholars, but also what are the unexamined things we need to be addressing as theological educators and as church leaders
wanting a church where we're really moving beyond a lot that we've inherited?
So I teach at Austin Seminary, just a couple hours south of here. And actually, I have in my introductory theology class now, and my teaching assistant is right over here, Pam Jarvis. I have a Buddhist student and a Muslim student and several self-proclaimed atheists. So things are even shifting in the class, which I think does add to the richness of the class. And it's challenging to me because I can't come in the class anymore and always say, here's what we think. I can't just assume, everyone agrees that God exists or God loves. But what I think we need to make more space for in seminary classrooms and in theological conversations is for skepticism, not only doubt. We've been working for a while on including doubt as part of faith, but I think we need to make room for skepticism too. So the way I think about it is, if someone who doubts is someone who can't believe what they want to believe, right? So you doubt, but you want to believe what you can't believe. Someone who's skeptical hasn't yet been able to kind of work their way to belief. And I think of even like Chris Wyman, if anyone's read My Bright Abyss. I think he's a leading voice in kind of opening up spaces. And Elizabeth Johnson talked about God in the spaces, in the darkness, the dark night of the soul. But I also think of figures like Nicodemus in Scripture. So here's Nicodemus he keeps showing up. He shows up at night in John 3, but then he shows up, and defends Jesus before the Sanhedrin and shows up at the tomb. And where are the places in theological education for the Nicodemuses who, I don't know, they're skeptics, but they're part of the community and they add something to the community that sometimes we've in the past shut out?
Theological education is a crazy place to be because the churches in the U.S. are crazy and shifting places to be right now. Yeah. But I love theological education because I love being a minister, and I love having the opportunity to help train people who care about community and about God and about the world. I feel like I've inherited so much from feminist theology, among other theologies, but feminist and liberation theologies, is the importance of the role of experience in doing theology and understanding God. And that's kind of what happens in ministry, whether you're in community justice ministry or you're in parish ministry or you're in like the hospice, hospital, prison, chaplaincy kind of ministry. Is you're dealing with everyone's real life experiences. And when you're in ministry, people tell you things that you don't believe are even possible in the world. You think only happen in movies. And then they're telling you about their life and you're going, yes, and inside you're going, oh my God. And so you learn to keep a straight face in the pastoral care classes, but hopefully in the theology classes, we've given you the tools to think about, well, clearly what people are experiencing affects how they understand God. And that we can't always give them the same thing that the people thought in 1920s Germany for 21st century United States problems, right? And so part of what we still get to do is that we still have to wrestle with how people really live, and what people really experience, and all the things that we end up addressing that are so beyond our pay grade as clergy, but that you're the first stop. Right? The first step for saying something meaningful, holy, important, and loving.
I've been, stalking you on Instagram and stuff during your book tour for Bipolar Faith, which is right back there and published by Fortress Press. I know that as ministers, one of the challenges is to figure out how to be vulnerable in the pulpit or in conversations, but also not to, turn the pulpit into a therapy session. And there's an interesting dynamic. But the moment you're able to share a part of your life, you discover that all the people you've been with for years as their minister actually have been struggling and dealing with experiences they didn't know were, they're like, oh, I had to sanitize it before it comes to worship, or before I talk to my minister, or before I even talk to my partner or my family. Can you describe kind of your experience, one sharing your own journey, but also kind of what it's like for other people to be given permission because you had the courage to share. There's some question in there that I've been wanting to ask you because we haven't seen each other in a bit.
What people ask me is, what is it like telling all your business to the world, right? Is that the question? In a way. On one way, I began by blogging, and that was kind of my foray into it, and I never, ever looked at the analytics. So I kind of threw it out there and then turned my head away and thought, okay, I hope they're reading it, but I kind of don't hope they're reading it. So the same thing with the book, like, I hope you're buying it, I hope you're reading it, but don't talk to me about the details. And what I find is very few people do actually ask me about the details. So for me, the vulnerability wasn't as hard because I knew it's my calling. I guess that's the best way of putting it, right? If I didn't feel called to do it, it would be, I don't think I could do it, right? So, and God and I, we had a little tango about this for years. And then I remembered that things usually go better when I do what God says. And I was able to do it. And, so I felt like I had the capacity, I had the ability to learn what I didn't know how to do. I wasn't working it out therapeutically because I had already worked it out in therapy. So for me, it was a narrative to offer for people who were looking for the kinds of narratives I was looking for looking for the voices of faith who are wrestling with mental health and with trauma and with fear and with poverty and all the things that I try to bring up. But I wanted to say what it felt like, not just what happened. And so what I do find happens is this is my ministry, right? That people will share, wow, me too. Or now I understand more of why my nephew committed suicide. I never understood. I mean, I get these amazing emails, and Instagram posts and social media posts from people, who are saying, I've always been looking for an answer to such and such, and now I know it's okay to lose faith. I'll find it again. Right. And then I'm like, wow, yeah, that's kind of like the ministry gold, right? If people feel more included, more welcome, more embraced, more part of the world and community and the divine whole.
So when we think of, the kind of the transition for theologians to take experience seriously and then to take more and more people's experience seriously, when you're thinking of ministers, what does it look like for congregations and for the worshiping life of a church and the way you spend your time, energy, money, and gathering together to take experience seriously? Does it feel like there's unexamined assumptions where half of the programs that we do at congregations are the ones they did before you were assigned anything other than varieties of white dude? And yet our theology is diversified. We've been challenged and listened and learned. And yet what it is congregations do when they gather hasn't really made space or changed and been impacted significantly by taking the experience of the larger body of Christ seriously.
Well, just building on what Monica was saying before, I think you're exactly right. I mean, even something as basic as taking the experience of grief and lament and doubt, those seriously in the context of Christian worship. I mean, it is a hard sell, even if we all think we're doing it or we want to do it. I mean, whether we have a traditional or a contemporary service, whether we're singing, praise ye the Lord, the Almighty, or our God's an awesome God. I mean, people walk into church and it's just happy Christian smile praise that says, certain experiences are better than others, and grief and sadness or depression are disallowed. You look at the Bible, and there's a heck of a lot of depression and doubt and and they're right in the same damn psalm. They don't even separate out.
Why have you betrayed me?
Rouse yourself, O God. Why are you sleeping? Psalm 44. Why have you forsaken me? And then they wind up with praise sometimes, and sometimes it goes the other way too. So, and that doesn't even get into different kinds of kind of cultural experiences, but just something that I think you could claim is a universal. Everyone has some amount of joy, and everyone has some amount of sorrow, and bringing the diversity that we all have in common into worship is hard enough before we even get to the other things.
I completely agree. And so I think, for congregates, you got to go rogue, man. I mean, if you can't get, the worship to change, because, it's kind of slow on the whole change thing. Then you have to go with what you know to be the case. I mean, so I didn't know what a lectionary was till I went to divinity school, because I didn't come from traditions that have lectionaries. Right? The lecture what? Right? But if you do come from a lectionary tradition, it misses all the juicy stuff, right? So you actually have to read the Bible yourself. Imagine that. Well, people can do that, right? They can get together and read a Bible. They can get together and read a memoir. You can get together and share your experiences. I mean, this is kind of what, those of us in Methodist and even evangelical traditions call small groups. Right, where you got together like in your houses and you talked about what you want to talk about, which is kind of how the whole Christianity thing started. Right, they were all sitting around in their houses talking about Jesus. Some dude who was here is now gone. What happened? Important. Right? So, we come from like 2,000 years of doing this. And so there's no reason why we can't do that again. Well, that sounds very orthodox to me.
Oh, I know. I'm just. It's like you go. Wait, I'm in a room of professional theologians. There are things called small groups. There are Christians. They read the Bible and they quote share.
Trip, it's even weirder. They're called house churches.
House churches. All right. So when we begin to think about the different trajectories of feminist thought, like, and what it means to take it seriously today, both either as like I got a text message in the middle of this from one of my friends, and he's like, I'm a Southern Baptist minister, but I want to figure out how to be a Southern Baptist minister who's a feminist. What does that look like? Are you allowed? And I think that's an important question, because people that listen and have loved Elizabeth Johnson, prior to this, I got an email, very long email by Dad that basically said, when listening to the conversation setting up today, I thought to myself, I never had to tell my daughter, no, you can't be a minister because of where I put her in a congregation. And I had to call her in college and say, I'm sorry. And I feel like that's an example of this situation where there's lots of people in the church who wish they had an idea of what does it mean to be a feminist, or to be an ally in different ways with all the different privileges, which if the feminist movement has demonstrated something, it's like you keep discovering over and over that locations have different privileges. It could be psychological disability issues. It could be race, gender, class. It could even be which denomination you're in, because that could really vary what's privileged in different ones. And I wonder, like, there are a lot of people that feel that overwhelmed in their congregation, in their setting, and going, what do I do? But I know what I don't want to do is not think about it and then have to call my daughter in college and say, I'm sorry, you can be a minister. And it was like unexamined thought popped in his mind because a nun that he listened to on a podcast pointed it out to him.
Yeah, I think my views on this are changing. I used to give big speeches about how a man couldn't call himself a feminist because he doesn't know what it is to be a woman. And I think that's all true. But I guess especially in the current situation in which we find ourselves contextually, I mean, all hands on deck. You know what I mean? Anyone who wants to be a feminist, sign up But I was thinking, when I was in college, I grew up fundamentalist. So I was taught that women couldn't be theologians. So this whole God thing got to me too. It's like it wasn't my idea, right? Because I had a hard time with my family for a long time. You kind of have to know that to hear this story. So I go to Brown. I major in religious studies. My parents didn't know. I did it secretly for a while. And there was a professor there named Wendell Dietrich who, let's just say, he didn't look like a feminist, didn't talk like a feminist, wasn't a feminist, in fact. He looked like, a traditional theologian, white male, power guy, wonderful teacher. But he kind of suspected that I didn't have something in my education that I needed. So one day he calls me to his office hours, which I didn't even realize this is unusual, for the professor to make time and call you up and say, come see me. And he gives me, it was in 1984. He didn't give me George Orwell, but he gave me a copy of Sexism and God Talk. He gave me a copy of this book. And then, it's a longer story than that, but he kind of, I thought I was going to be a missionary at the time. I didn't think women, not that being a missionary would be bad, but, missionaries, if you grow up fundamentalist, that's a way you can do service, and still be legal as a minister, right? Anyway, he, kind of one thing, led to another, and he encouraged me to go to Princeton Seminary and do my MDiv. But I think of it now, and I think that I wouldn't say that Wendell Dietrich was a feminist, but I would say that he was a feminist mentor to me because he knew that there was something in my experience that he wasn't able to meet and work with. And so he found ways, though, of speaking to my experiences by giving me feminist texts and even just calling me into his office and devoting time to talking to me about what it was like to be in my situation. So I'll even say he's a feminist if he would take that on.
I think this example you give, Tripp, is a really good one, right? If we think about the women in our lives, our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, right? What do we want for them, right? Makes it much easier to be a feminist by whatever name you want to choose. Right? No one wants to really tell people they love, no, you can't do the things that make your heart leap. Right? No, you can't have the same things as your brother, as someone else. And so I think in many ways that's where it begins, by this relationality, right? The deep relationality of love that we have for the people we care about. And what would we want for them? Well, why wouldn't we want that for everyone? I think the other part is thinking about what makes us what we are in terms of our faith, right? So, I don't know Southern Baptist well, but giving you that example, I know Baptist well. I grew up Baptist. And when I was a kid, the only thing I knew about Baptists was that they sang Sweet, Sweet Spirit and the Methodists sang I Surrender All. And that's what I thought were the differences. But I will say, and I understood, you get to make your decision about when you believe and then you get dunked in the water, right? So nothing about that says no women, right? It just says you make your own decision, declaration of belief, and we dunk you in the water. That's a big Baptist thing. Well, how in the world does that conflict with, right, believing that men and women and children and trans persons are equal? It doesn't, right? So part of it, I think, is also getting at what are the core tenets of our faith. And usually they have very little to do with social practice, right? So we can actually maintain the tenets of our faith while evolving and growing in our social practices and beliefs.
That's good.
I'm wondering, when you see people who come to you in office hours, when young women come to you, and you see signs of the internalization of that no, what do you do when you see a young woman come to you who's studying for ministry, who's trying to get over the no that they still hear echoing through their head and wrestling with that? How do you help them through that?
I think what I get the most in that line is not people who've heard no, but women in graduate school, right, where no one's ever asked them what they think. I have students in doctoral programs where they can tell you what everyone else thinks, what every other scholar has said, and I have to keep making them rewrite things to say, but I want to know what you think. And it pains me that means no one asked them as a child, no one asked them as an adolescent in college, either personally or professionally, what do you think? And so they think that their thoughts don't matter, and they don't even know how to get to what they think. Because no one's asked them in 22, 30 years. So what I do is I just keep asking until they can give me something. And I make people rewrite, and I say, I know it's here. I see it in you. I want you to put it on the page. And students tell me that they cry doing this, that they hate my classes, that they go home and, they've written this paper 7 times, and I won't give them a grade until I can see what they think. That's what they say at the time. Before they graduate, usually they like me again.
Yeah, and after too.
Right? But yeah, I think that still has to happen. So it's not that people have been told no, it's that they've been ignored, muted, invisibilized. That's how we say no nowadays. Okay.
It's interesting how assertive you have to be. I find this is true as well. It's not so much, sort of showing sympathy. Oh yeah, I know how it is. It's hard to voice your opinion, or it's hard to speak up in class. You really have to kind of make rules that are helpful, and sometimes people don't like them, and we don't. But I make rules for female students. Sometimes I'll say to them, "You have to say something every class," and they'll say, "Really, every class?" Yep. But what if I don't have anything to say? I don't care. I don't care what you say. You can just recite the alphabet, but your voice has to come out. And what I find is that they almost always say things that are a lot better than certain other people in the class who talk incessantly. So it works out. But just something that concrete, and then they obediently do it, and then break free of Me Too and the rule itself, because then you can't get them to shut up after a while. But it's a good problem to have.
Sometimes I've said to my students, well, even if you ask a question, that's still putting your voice out on the table. But I'm wondering if you think that's even that's still too passive. Do you want it to be in the declarative as opposed to the interrogative?
That's a good question. I think that questions are generally pretty creative and constructive. So I think having them ask a question, just saying something out loud in a voice that can be heard in the classroom. Or, when we train ministers too, I don't know if you find this, but I've taken women into the chapel at the school and just made them really ask them, but forcefully, to project their voice to the back corner, and they can do it. They just don't know they can do it because nobody has told them they can do it before. And have you ever looked at Susan Brown Miller's book, Femininity? It's an old book, but it is hilarious and brilliant and kind of depressing in a way too. But the chapters are like hair, voice, skin. And every chapter is about how a woman's job is to differentiate herself from the man in order to make men feel secure. So I have on a dress, so you don't have to worry. I'm not going to usurp your power. And that's really important. And if I really wanted to, not usurp your power, I would talk in a soft voice or not make constructive points. And so to break out of that socialization is hard for all of us, even those of us teaching others to do it.
One thing a question, I'm not even sure the exact right way to ask it, but having been in a PhD program and gone and visited lots of them, why are systematic theologians the most male version of all the PhD programs? Because if you, I thought I made this up, and then I started texting friends at other ones, and almost every discipline, ethics, any Bible discipline, if you got culture there, ministry, practical theology, but the moment it gets near systematic theology, it's just,
dudes.
Are you a systematician?
No, I'm actually not.
I don't really know, but I've noticed that. I went to grad school in 1990 and still at Princeton Seminary, I was the only woman admitted in systematics that year, actually in the whole PhD program. And at the time, the whole theology faculty was male in 90, which isn't that long ago, is it? It is kind of long ago.
Cynthia, it is not that long ago.
And it hasn't gotten better. I think I'm more Hegelian than I thought. Do you understand what I mean? Like, I thought history would kind of work its way out and it would get better. Absolute Geist would win. But it's in 20 years, there aren't more women. It feels like it's hard to find systematic theologians who are female. That goes back to my mentoring point. I'm trying to figure out right now, what do we do about that? Because the field is dominated by men. Yeah.
I'm a philosophical theologian, but I teach systematics. I play a systematician on TV. I'll take the job. I can do it, even though it's not my home base. And I do want to I think Bible gives us a run for our money, I have to say, actually. I think the percentages of women in Bible and people of color in Bible are much lower, than they are in theology. I would put some money on that. That being said, so I don't think we're the worst. I think we're bad, but I think it gets worse.
SBL.
No, I truly do think it gets worse. I think you can almost, if you took some time, you could count everyone. I don't think you can count all of us in theology. In terms of systematics, what I find more problematic than the white men teaching systematics is that if at Claremont School of Theology, we used to all rotate systematic theology. And for a variety of curricular reasons, we don't anymore. That I find problematic because my 3 colleagues and I all teach systematics very, very differently. And I do have colleagues who I like over coffee, but who will produce a syllabus of all white people or all white men, or they'll throw in like a James Cone book from 1970. Like nothing black has been written since then, right? And like, at least put my book in. I mean, come on, right? Like, you don't know anybody else doing theology, right? But just their default mode of theology of what they think should be taught is very different than what I think is the default mode of theology. And it's not like that's tied to white maleness. You could be a white male and teach cool, provocative, interesting, diverse stuff. But I think because people don't, the field keeps looking like that.
Okay, so one more question, and then we're going to play a Bible game with Daniel. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay, you looked at me like I didn't want to cut you off.
I'm surprised about the Bible game.
Oh.
I'm excited about the Bible game.
You like Bible.
I do.
I know. Episcopalians have to read it every worship service.
A lot.
I know. If you're a UCC-er, you could just have a sermon series on a movie.
God bless them.
All right. So, and this question got sent in on Twitter to me, not during this, but in preparation for it. I said, hey, and if you have something you want me to ask a bunch of theologians when they get together about the future of theology and the shape different women voices have had in it, just go ahead and tell me. And the response was, I left the church when I was in middle school because I never thought I had a place. And this is a female. And we were friends in high school. And she's like, but I'm thinking of coming back, but want to know, am I really wanted? Ooh. And so how do you describe, as female theologians, the invitation to be a full, equal participant in the body of Christ when there are people who love Jesus, would love the community, would like to be a part of a congregation, but want to know, can I trust this institution and this body? Should I come back?
You can't trust the institution. The institution is still not always welcoming to women, and that would be I hate to say it, but that would backfire if that were a promise made. I do think we can trust God, but sometimes it's hard to see God clearly when the community that is on the ground in the context of the institution isn't welcoming. But I think, Elizabeth Johnson was talking about being stubborn and how helpful that is. I think along those lines of Barbara Jordan, who was a Texas state senator, African-American with MS. So she had things that marginalized her about herself, and she was also female, and she told the story. It was at some event, I think, for Jimmy Carter for his inauguration. Look it up, but where she said that she remembered the first time she read the Constitution, and she said, "This is good stuff. We got freedom, liberty, justice. But wait a minute, this is not." She realized, written for me. It was written for, white property owning, male Americans. So she says something like, this is a paraphrase, I had to decide whether I was going to kind of say, well, this isn't mine, this Constitution, and give it over to those for whom it was intended, or I was going to audaciously say, I'm laying claim to it anyhow, even if it wasn't intended for me. And people who knew her knew that she always carried a copy of the Constitution around in her purse with her. And at some point, I think I would encourage and try to walk with this middle school person and say, we're going to take this tradition. Elizabeth Johnson really talked this way, I think. And we're going to put it in our purse or put it in our pocket, put it in our heart. And we are going to just claim not only that we limb the boundaries. I think there's value to that, by the way, the role of Mary Daly limbing and then being, I'm not putting that down, but I'm saying there's also a place for the middle school person, for Elizabeth Johnson, to say, I am right smack in the heart of this tradition, making a contribution to it. And whether people know it or not, right? Oh, yeah, that was the line from Barbara Jordan. She said, so I decided that they must have just forgotten and left me out and folded up the Constitution and put it in her purse. So that's the image I keep in mind.
Well, yeah, that's a way better answer than mine. I would say, I agree with you. You can't say, do they want me? Right? I can say with all confidence, God wants you. And that's a pretty big thing right there. Right. Because so many of us have conflated what churches do with what God does. And so again, to make that distinction and say, yes, number one, God wants you. I would say number two, and all my bias as a minister, is that we are meant to be in community. And number three, if you look hard enough, you will find it. So I'm not sure which church that she's looking to go back to, but there have been times when I've moved around the country enough, like you have in a lot of ways, and every time you move, you have to look for another church. And when I made the move to California this most recent time, I was like, somewhere in the greater Los Angeles area, there is a church that worships in the Black worship tradition that is inclusive of people no matter who they love. I will find it. Gosh darn it. And I went to a lot of churches and walked out of a lot of churches. And the problem, of course, is the greater Los Angeles area. So I found it. It is not close to where I live, but it is drivable because I said, I want a church that wants me and the people I love. And I drive by eons and scores of places to get there. But it is there. And I found it because I was on Facebook complaining. And one pastor's like, that's me. I'm like, no. Yeah. I'm like, I don't even believe you. And he had to take me to lunch and prove to me that this was his theology. And I was like, okay. And indeed it truly was, right? So I would say there are enough churches of large and small ilk of most places. You can find it. And then, of course, if you can't find it, you just get 4 other people who think like you and you start one in your house.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Homebrewed Christianity. Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the episode. Congratulations. And this is the time where if you made it to the end, I want to say, hey, here's a little way you can give us a little help, a little shout back. You could go to iTunes, review, and rate this. You could borrow your friend's phone, download this podcast on their phone, maybe review and rate it as them, and say you should listen. You can become a member of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. We have a community called the Homebrewed Community. All you got to do is go to homebrewedcommunity.com and you join, and you donate each month. Keeps the podcast going, and then we have a private group on Facebook. We do extra classes together, do all sorts of stuff. It's awesome. I think you should do it. I'm kind of biased, but still, you can check that out. You can always go to homebrewedchristianity.com, click the link over to go to Amazon. You don't shop any way different, other than when you do, they send us a little percentage. That's one way to support the podcast. And the fourth way, which is the best way, is to proselytize. right? Like people been going door to door. It makes people feel bad. Tell them about hell. You don't have to do that. You just gotta tell your other theology nerd friends about homebrewed Christianity. Say, did you know I'm a deacon? And they're like, how could you be a deacon? You have all these questions and doubts. It doesn't make sense to me. Well, I'm a homebrewed Christianity deacon. They ordain everyone that listens. So that means you could be one too. Oh, that's really cool. How do I do that? Give me your phone, and then you download it, and tell them to listen to it. And say, hey, listen to it next week. I'll buy you a beer while we talked about it. Boom. All right. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Complete joy. Peace.